Ready? Okay, well, good evening, everybody. I hope you can hear me and see me. Welcome to our session this evening on the United States and the world after January 6th. Actually, I think we're really talking about America and the world after November 3rd, 2020 and January 6th, 2021. In any event, welcome to the audience and to the panelists. I'm John Harper, Emeritus Professor of American Foreign Policy at the Bologna Center, SAIS Europe. It's nice to have a glimpse, at least, of the class of 2021. I see about 3 or 4 of you, one of whom I know, Sarah, from last year. I might mention, if I could, that February 2021 is something of an anniversary for me because it was in February 1981, not long after the inauguration of Ronald Reagan, that I became a resident professor at the Bologna Center, as it was known. So I'm going to start with a brief historical introduction. And then I'm going to offer 2 possible ways of looking at the question where the United States is headed after November 3rd and January 6th. My thesis about Trump's election in 2016, the rise of Trump, is that it was partly the product of immediate and contingent factors, things that might have been different. The choice of the Democratic candidate, who in some ways was tailor-made for Trump to run against in 2016. FBI interference, although the exact effect of that will never be known. Trump's shrewd electoral strategy of focusing on the swing states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. These are contingent factors. But there were more long-term, deeper factors as well. At a deeper level, my thesis is that Trump's rise was a product of a revolt that had been gestating for a number of years against 2 pillars of post-war policy embraced by both the Republican and the Democratic Party. Number 1, economic globalization, understood as the deliberate removal of barriers to the flow of goods, capital, and people. And second, the role of the United States as a liberal hegemon and a policeman of key areas of the world. In the first decade of the 21st century, after China joined the WTO, 5.9 million manufacturing jobs were lost in the United States, a decline of 34% of the total. In the same years, the number of foreign-born residents in the United States rose to unprecedented levels. In 2016, there were an estimated 11 million illegal immigrants residing in the United States. Meanwhile, the US role as liberal hegemon and policeman had led to what many, and I would agree with them, saw as strategic blunders and endless wars. The only surprising thing, perhaps, was that a populist politician claiming to be the champion of the perceived victims of globalization and endless wars had not emerged long before 2016. Now, this analysis probably underestimated the weight of cultural factors, including what in the 1960s and 70s had been called the white backlash. The fear and resentment of whites, especially rural whites, working class whites, Christian nationalist whites, vis-a-vis an increasingly multicultural and secular society where they did not think they belonged. A model of society, of course, embodied by, represented by, championed by the first African-American president of the United States. In any case, in 2016, Trump was a symptom and a beneficiary of basic trends in the United States, but certainly not the cause. So now 4 years later, we can ask a somewhat different question. To what extent is Trump the cause as well as the effect of basic trends? We can begin to assess the impact of his presidency in light of what has happened. And to help frame the discussion, I'd like to offer you 2 different perspectives on the effects of the Trump presidency and where the United States is headed after November 3rd and January 6th. The first perspective is to see his presidency, despite his defeat, as a success in its own terms and laying the groundwork for future success by the Republican Party. In 2016, Trump received 63 million votes, 46.1%. In 2020, he received almost 74 million votes, 46.8% of the total. In 2020, he consolidated his hold on white working class voters, rural voters, Christian nationalist voters, and increased his share of Hispanic and even of African American voters, giving the lie to the thesis that demographic trends will make the Democratic Party the majority party in the United States. Trump increased his share of the vote because, in general, his supporters believed that he had delivered on the economy, on his Supreme Court and other federal court appointments, at least partially on immigration, and on China, where he at least began to level the playing field. His pandemic performance was chaotic, but the pandemic was not the #1 issue for a majority of voters in the United States. And his Warp Speed project did deliver a vaccine in the end. His foreign policy was to some degree taken over by more traditional Republican conservatives, but he did avoid new military adventures overseas. Despite his defeat, despite January 6th, Trump and his allies are in firm control of the Republican Party at all levels, state, local, national, Republican National Committee. Trump's Political Action Committee is full of money to be used to make Republican candidates toe the line in 2022. Despite his defeat, despite January 6th, only 10 of 211 Republican members of Congress voted to impeach him, and only 5 out of 50 Republican senators voted to authorize or to approve the Senate trial, which begins tomorrow. The Republican Party may well be a minority party, but it has an armory of weapons to help it retain a disproportionate share of political power, including gerrymandering, which we're going to see now as congressional seats are reapportioned in light of the 2020 census, control of the judicial branch. The Electoral College itself is an essential prop of Republican power since it overrepresents the small red state. Finally, some of the basic trends of which Trump was a symptom and a beneficiary have not only not disappeared, but have actually become more pronounced during the last 4 years. Economic inequality, the racial divide, the racial and cultural divide, the rural-urban divide, the steady, this is interesting, the steady decline in religious belief in the United States, reinforcing the view of Christian nationalists that they're a besieged minority who need, as one of their leaders put it, a bodyguard like Donald Trump. So perspective #1. Let me give you now a quite different perspective, and if you're a Democrat, a more hopeful one about the future. First of all, economic inequality. If economic inequality is a breeding ground for right-wing populism, the Democrats are now in a position to do something about it. They're now in a position to address that problem and to win back some of their traditional working class base. That may mean, by the way, in some areas, following the example of Donald Trump, following paths forged by Trump himself, for example, in foreign economic policy. Second, a significant portion of the Republican electorate who supported Trump in 2016 deserted him in 2020. Over 65-year-olds, college-educated whites, suburban voters all over the country of all ages. And it seems unlikely that those voters would return to him in the future, especially in light of January 6th. You can't help but wonder how many of those 74 million voters would have supported Trump if they had had any inkling of what was going to happen on January 6th. January 6th exposed the extremist wing of Trump world, the Proud Boys, the 3%ers, the Oath Keepers. They've all become household words now, and they are now a top priority of the Justice Department and the FBI. And finally, one of the most important results of November 23rd and January 6th is that the Republican Party is facing an almost intractable dilemma. Trump is still powerful and popular, but many Republicans, from Liz Cheney, Mitch McConnell himself, and many others know that he is morally compromised and he will be a millstone dragging the party down. There are plenty of contenders to replace him, but none of them, not Hawley, not Cruz, not Haley, would have the same appeal. Trump might try to anoint one of his children or even his son-in-law but my guess is that that would split the Republican Party. Almost by definition, the object of a cult of personality is irreplaceable, which is why parties may self-destructively cling to them. A good example in this country is Silvio Berlusconi's party, Forza Italia. Since it has been unable to find a new charismatic leader, Forza Italia has clung to an 84-year-old convicted felon, and it now has about 8% of the electorate in this country. So as a matter of fact, and to conclude, the Republican Party clinging to Trump may be exactly what Democrats should be hoping for. Well, there's much more that could be said, but I'd like to stop here and I'd give the floor now to my colleague, Rafael Baritonel, who is joining us from home. Raffaella is professor of American history, United States history at the University of Bologna. She's a leading specialist on that subject in this country. So Raffaella.
Thank you, John. Thank you for inviting me. So we still have a vivid memory of what happened at the beginning of January, which raised the issue of the fragility of the American democracy. Richard Haas wrote on Foreign Affairs that we will experience the passage from present at the disruption to present at the destruction. The images of the mob assaulting Capitol Hill, trying to interrupt the political process of certifying the electoral college vote, the violence, were all elements that reinforced the beliefs of many foreign observers that something was wrong with the American democracy. Haas continued, I quote, a post-American world, one no longer defined by US primacy, is coming sooner than generally expected, less because of the inevitable rise of others than because of what the United States has done to itself. I'm not an expert of American foreign policy or international relations, and therefore I don't want to focus on that, but it's important to understand if, to what extent, Trump provoked a boldness in the presidency as an institution, and therefore how Biden will be able to restore the presidency as a symbol of a national unity. In the last few weeks, many commentators quoted the famous Daniel Ziblatt and Stephen Levitsky's book, How Democracies Die. Commenting on Trump's intimidations of Georgia Secretary of State, Ziblatt said, I quote, we were criticized by some as alarmist. It turns out we weren't alarmist enough. From the start of his presidency, Trump was at war within and without racing to banish the disloyals. In particular, Trump had constantly positioned himself as an insurgent, as the leader of his political faction. The attempt to break the long tradition of the peaceful transition of power could be considered the most revealing proof of how dangerous political polarization proves to be when the presidency is involved. In the 1830s, Tocqueville wrote that the President of the United States possessed almost royal prerogatives, which he had no opportunity of exercising. Of course, this is not the case anymore. As we all know, foreign policy and military and economic emergencies have been the two areas that historically have encouraged the enlargement of presidential authority. In the 1970s, Arthur Schlesinger defined as imperial the huge amount of power concentrated in Johnson and Nixon presidencies. The definition of imperial presidency was used in connection with the Iran-Contra Gate during the Reagan presidency, and of course with reference to the Bush administration after 9/11. However, or at least from the rhetorical and symbolic point of view, American presidents have always tried not to forget that they were head of the state and not only head of the executive. Then what has been new with the Trump presidency, and what are the lessons we should learn from that experience? First of all, in my view, the problem is not polarization in itself. the history of the American political system has always registered high levels of political polarization. Few examples: the political conflict around the problem of slavery in the 19th century, the election of the 1896, the challenger represented by the Populist Party, the 1930s. Moreover, delegitimization has been historically a rhetorical strategy used by political candidates in various moments of the American history. Perhaps it's true that party polarization is as American as apple pie, as Dan Hood and Soren Jordan stated. For instance, in 1896, William McKinley accused Bryan the populists of being communist, anarchist, dangerous radicals. In the 1930s, some Republicans said that FDR was not just a dangerous radical, but a demagogue, more dangerous than the late William Jennings Bryan, and many other examples could be raised. What was different at that time and until the 1990s was that the delegitimization ended with the end of the political campaigns. The problem, so, is not the polarization in itself, but the crisis of political parties and their ability to be a filter in terms of choice of candidates to Congress and, above all, to the presidency. Timothy Snyder wrote in the New York Times that the responsibilities for Trump's push to overturn the election had to be shared by the Republican members of the Congress, or most of them. They were co-responsible in sharing the diffusion of his electoral fiction. From this point of view, the Republican Party has the responsibility to have pursued the strategy of winning by any means. So Trump did not start its process, as John said before. He only accelerated. However, in choosing Trump in 2016, the Republican Party abdicated to its role to avoid the risk of nominating an extremist demagogue. Once elected, Trump was the example of what a real populist president would be. Not a president who has a populist language or rhetoric, but a president who considers himself above the institutions because he is responsive only to the people, which means who are his people. So I go back again to Daniel Ziblatt, who said that healthy democracy requires two political parties that know how to compete and lose, two parties committed to the rules and norms of democracy. The second point to be stressed is how then Biden could restore presidency within the normal constitutional process. It's not easy to say. Of course, Biden could restore dignity, formal respect of the rules. He could act as the representative of the nation as such. However, dignity and respect are very important, but not enough. Barack Obama had tried to give new dignity to the presidency after Bush Jr. to restore faith in the ability of the president to act in terms of dialogue and cooperation. It didn't work, maybe because Obama, the first African-American president in the White House, was considered an insult by white supremacists. And however, I would also add that Trump put to the extreme trends which were already there. The concept of unitary presidency, the idea that the presidency should be free to act with very few constraints, were already in place before Trump. So the challenges Biden will face are in a way impervious. He had to restore faith in the ability of the presidency to act beyond political differences and for the common good. He has to respond to the issues raised by the Democratic coalition, especially in terms of social justice, racial justice, climate change, economic recovery, vaccination, in order to act as the president of the nation and not only of the Democratic Party. He should find a way to cooperate with the Congress. That's the problem. A more active Congress, and not a Congress paralyzed by the cold civil war between the two parties, will also be crucial in restoring the presidency within the arena framed by the Constitution. From this point of view, I'm convinced that Kamala Harris could play an important role in this effort to restore a fruitful relationship between the president and the Congress on many crucial points of Biden agenda. I stop here because perhaps I have no more time, but perhaps in a second round, I would like to add a few words about the first Black South Asian vice president. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, let me wait. Okay. Frosini, my colleague. Okay. All right, thank you. Justin Frosini, Adjunct Professor of Constitutional Law and Director of the Center for Constitutional and Studies and Democratic Development here at the Center. Many of you know, does not need an introduction. Justin.
Thank you, John. As usual, it's very nice to be able to take part in a panel like this. And before I start, let me pay homage to our chair, Professor Harper, because I remember taking part in a previous panel quite a while ago when the Democratic primary elections had just started, and many were convinced that Biden would not even get through those elections. And John was firm in saying that Biden not only would be the Democrats' presidential candidate, but he would win the elections in 2020. So yeah. I don't know whether he put any money on that, but one should remember this. So I remember it very.
Forgotten myself.
Having said that, okay, I'm going to hone into what I obviously wanted to talk about. I'm not an expert by any means of American foreign policy and so forth. What I want to look at specifically is the US Constitution. And I have to say that Biden's election and inauguration, and here I won't pretend to be bipartisan, very pleased that Joe Biden has won the elections. And I think it will certainly be a breath of fresh air with respect to the last 4 years. But I don't think this in itself does anything to repair what Samuel Levinson has called the fault lines in the Constitution, where these various constitutional fault lines continue to threaten the United States, and as a result, all of us, because we cannot, this is where the, if you like, the foreign policy, the geopolitical element comes into play, okay? Whatever happens in the United States is also important for those of us that are not from the US. First thing that I think needs to be underlined, and of course is related to something that John referred to, i.e. The Electoral College, and I'm sure in the Q&A we'll have the chance to talk about this a little bit more. I'm not sure whether we, maybe through the euphoria of having seen Biden win and so on and so forth, we need to really realize that we came very, very close to a genuine disaster with another Donald Trump electoral vote victory. Because all it would have needed was small percentages of votes shifted in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona, and that would have rendered irrelevant the fact that Biden had got 7 million more votes than Trump. And of course, that's the very reason why we have, and we had, I like this expression used by Raffaella, this electoral fiction on the part of Trump, because he knew very well that it would just need a small number of votes in those states to switch, and that would have changed the majority in the Electoral College. Another thing, which obviously is another fault line in the Constitution, is, I have to say it, great fun for the journalists. Anyone who's been following the transition, this is stuff that makes news. But I don't believe for a single moment that the United States benefited from the fact that Donald Trump held his office and all of its powers for 11 weeks after Election Day. And for that matter, more than a month after state electors met in their respective state capitals and cast their votes, making Biden the clear and unequivocal president-elect, despite obviously the fantasies of Trump with regard to electoral fraud and so on and so forth. And moreover, the US didn't benefit at all from 2 long weeks where we were wondering what was going to happen after the official certification in the morning of January the 7th, after what happened on Capitol Hill. But all of that happens because it's in the 20th Amendment of the Constitution. This is the Constitution that tells us this. Now, Biden is president. Can we all rejoice? Well, to be honest, I think it's not going to be easy for Biden to be able to get through an audacious program. Raffaella is right. It's historical that we have Kamala Harris as vice president. I'll be interested in hearing what she has to say about the first African, South Asian vice president of the United States. But the truth of the matter is that it is not going to be easy for Kamala Harris. If Biden has any hope of getting legislation through Congress, Harris is going to have to spend most of her time in the Senate. Among other things, allow me to underline another very peculiar feature of the US system is the vice president in itself, which is sort of hangs between the executive and the legislative. Can I say this as a Brit or a half Brit? Reminds me a bit of the Lord Chancellor in the United Kingdom, okay, which we've actually abolished. So this is another very strange thing. So in a way, if Kamala Harris thinks she's going to be spending a lot of time in the White House sharing policy-making decisions with Biden, I think that's going to be problematic from a legislative point of view, unless, as Raffaella was saying, Harris is able to change the rules and to put an end to this clash between the two sides. But frankly, I don't see that happening. We just have to think about what happened on the morning of the 7th with the certification. After Capitol Hill had been under assault, the day afterwards, the great majority of Republicans were prepared not to certify the results of the elections in what I can only consider, making a comparison, the equivalent of what the center-right majority in Italy did many years ago. John mentioned Berlusconi in Forza Italia, when the majority in parliament, including the current president of the Italian Senate, voted saying that Ruby Rubacuori was the niece of President Mubarak. Okay, what had happened the day before did not change the minds of the great majority of the Republicans in Congress. Therefore, I think it's highly unlikely that this clash between these two parties is going to change. John also mentioned the issue of redistricting. Because of the Democrats' poor results at state level, in particular in Texas, we're going to continue to see ever more sophisticated gerrymanders, and that's going to minimize Democratic electoral success. And again, this is a problem related to the way that the constitutional system works. And of course, on this gloomy note, the worst structural feature of the US Constitution is Amendment 5, which is the amendment clause, which makes amending the Constitution almost impossible. Because basically, at least theoretically, you could have 13 states that basically comprise less than 5% of the entire national population can veto any proposal that is made by Congress. And this is a problem, okay? And I don't think Joe Biden is going to be able to rectify this structural problem that the United States has in terms of its constitutional system. Moreover, one of the reactions that we've had, now on this one I still have mixed feelings about this, one of the reactions to the assault on Capitol Hill was, you know, this is touching the Constitution is sacred. Now, on one hand, I do believe, and maybe this we can discuss during Q&A, that having gone as far as to assault Capitol Hill and to touch those institutions could maybe still be considered a difference between the US as a consolidated liberal democracy and other countries where this would not have been seen as so serious as it was. On the other hand, however, to start talking about the Constitution as sacred, and again, allow me the comparison with Italy. I've heard this being used in the Italian context as well. Don't touch the Constitution, it's sacred, means that certain structural problems caused by that Constitution, here I'm referring to the US, but I could also refer to Italy, cannot be resolved by considering the Constitution a sacred text. And then, of course, let us come to the more current issue, and then I will stop because I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about this. There is the second impeachment of Donald Trump. Here, as you probably know, I won't go into the details, we can maybe discuss it more in detail in the, sorry, play on words, during the Q&A. But as you know, there are some that contest the fact that Donald Trump can be impeached now that he has left office, okay? Now, for what it's worth, I'll just say this briefly now, and we can go into more detail later, but I don't think this interpretation is correct. The Republicans tried this by saying that basically an impeachment procedure towards a president that has left office is unconstitutional. I don't think that is correct because it can go forward, and the whole issue is because what the Democrats want in the end is disqualification. And disqualification, in my opinion, from a legal point of view, is possible even if Trump has left office. But there is also a non-legal element that comes into play, and that is it really convenient for President Biden to find himself in a situation where Congress, and more specifically the Senate, is tied up in this impeachment procedure for so long, in a way, maybe ruining the famous first 100 days of his presidency, because there's a high risk of this giving Trump a platform from which he can return to the center of the scene. Okay, this is obviously, as always in constitutional law, the political and the constitutional elements that come into play. I haven't mentioned the issue also of the Supreme Court and the problems related to the way that the justices of the Supreme Court are appointed, but that's something we can maybe come back to. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you very much. And now our final speaker, it's a pleasure to introduce our colleague, Michael Leigh. Michael is Academic Director of the Master's Program in European Public Policy and Senior Adjunct Professor. Michael has a somewhat different perspective on things. And it was in honor of Michael that we included in the title of this session, America and the World. So Michael, over to you.
Thanks very much, John, and thanks for adapting the title of the session. I did think that as SAIS is par excellence, a transatlantic institution, in fact, a transcontinental institution with campuses in Washington, in Europe, in Bologna, and indeed in China, that it would be interesting to spend a little while on what the election of Biden means to Europeans and how the European Union has responded and what some of the challenges may be in the period ahead. I think the first thing I'd like to say is that EU leaders on the whole welcomed Biden's election with a great sense of relief after the Trump years. Biden was perceived in most European capitals as like-minded, as sharing European approaches on multilateralism, on democratic values, and the desire to work together with allies. and that this was in very sharp contrast to the experience of the previous 4 years. Less than a month after the election of Biden, the European Union, the Commission, the High Representative came up with an extremely ambitious document entitled The New EU-US Agenda for Global Change. And in the introduction to this document, it was described as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to rebuild transatlantic relations. It invited the Biden administration to work together with the EU across a wide range of current priorities in great detail. Obviously, the pandemic, public health in general, foreign policy, security, climate, trade, technology, reinforcing the multilateral rules-based order, and in a very Brussels kind of way, went right down to the challenge of deforestation, felt very strongly by Mr. Macron, especially vis-a-vis Brazil, preserving biodiversity, a very wide-ranging and ambitious agenda. Even before he became president, Biden and the transition team welcomed this, but it became clear pretty soon that this document, welcome though it was as a statement of intentions by Biden, is very much based on EU priorities. And the approach again and again is basically to invite Biden as a like-minded American president to sign up to initiatives which are very important to the EU. Before our session this evening, I went through the document, and you find again and again, the EU invites the US to join the global response on vaccines. The EU calls on the US to join the trade and health initiative of the World Trade Organization. The EU encourages the US to join the Convention on Biodiversity, etc. So basically, this is the EU international agenda, its response to global challenges, and it's rather inviting Biden to sign up to them. The document is also rather typically EU and procedural, full of dialogues, agendas, roadmaps, and so on. More importantly, it mentions China, which is the overwhelming foreign policy priority of the Biden administration, only in passing towards the end of the document. Whereas in reality, I think how Europe situates itself between China and the United States is probably going to be the defining issue of the years ahead. It doesn't analyze divergences in perceived interest between the US and the EU, or even acknowledges them. And it's extremely fulsome in talking about common values. It writes about the EU and the US essentially having a commonality of outlook and priorities on domestic and international agendas. So, I mean, one can read between the lines the relief, the enthusiasm, the desire to cooperate, but at the same time, I don't think there's sufficient understanding in the EU's response for the fact that Biden is just 18 months away from the 2022 midterm elections. And that is going to really determine the extent to which he is ready to join the EU in this very ambitious agenda. I think he's going to be ready to work with the EU when this helps to address the concerns of those disgruntled American voters that John was talking about, especially on issues like jobs, reshoring, and value chains. This clearly will be the priority of the Biden administration. It's been said very often that his overwhelming priorities will be domestic. Of course, it's been frequently the experience in the United States that a president begins his term of office believing this, then runs into very serious difficulties on the domestic agenda and turns to foreign policy almost with a sense of relief. So I don't think we should take it as read that Biden will be so overwhelmed by domestic policy that he will not have the time for this agenda with the EU, but rather he will gauge which issues he's ready to engage in on what they may mean for him primarily in the domestic political context. This approach from Brussels also rather skims over long-standing problems which are not going to disappear just because there's a new administration in Washington, particularly on trade, for example. It's clear that Biden is not going to reverse overnight Trump's position, the long-standing problem of Boeing and Airbus, the tariffs on European steel and aluminium, as we say in Europe, and the retaliatory tariffs which are there from Europe. President Biden issued an executive order within days of taking office, tightening Buy American rules for public purchasing by the federal government, causing consternation in Europe. If this wasn't maybe America first, Trump style, but Buy American, the proportion of American origin goods that have to be there to qualify for federal public purchasing schemes were increased. So yes, Europe is right to believe that Biden is a president that is closer to European values than his predecessor, but shouldn't jump to the immediate conclusion that Biden is ready to buy into this agenda, which is so important to Europe. More fundamentally, I think there's a distinction in foreign policy on the issues where the two sides might wish to engage between their respective approach. For the United States, the world today, the international relations today revolve very much around the United States, China, to a much lesser degree, Russia, but Russia is still there, and Europe, whether the European institutions or the European states. And the United States takes a geopolitical approach to these issues. And there's a ferment of discussion in the United States today about what the approach should be, notably to China. We had published just a few days ago by the Atlantic Council this longer telegram by an anonymous author setting out a pretty aggressive agenda for handling relations between China, even almost a regime change agenda. This is not the position of the administration, but it's out there. It's being actively discussed. A much more moderate and thoughtful paper by Rudd going over the same territory. So the idea that Europe might situate itself somewhere between China and the United States, picking and choosing the issues on which it wishes to side with the United States, but on many other issues, choosing to go its own way, is likely to be a point of difference between Washington and the United States in the years ahead. Europe, and particularly its major member states, Germany and France, are in a paradoxical situation, because an identity issue for the European Union are the defense of European values, of human rights, the rule of law, and democracy. And yet, when it comes to European policy towards China and Russia, it's economics rather than these values, or indeed geopolitics for that matter, which determine their relations. And it's understandable. China is overwhelmingly the main market for German exports, for example. For the United States, it's a much less significant market. And for the US, the issue is mainly Chinese imports, imports into the United States from China. And for Germany, questions like Nord Stream 2, the new gas pipeline, which is nearing completion, and now the purchase of vaccines, the possible purchase of vaccines from Russia, if the Sputnik 5 vaccine is approved by the European Medicines Agency, will also be another form of engagement with Russia. So I think what we're going to see in the years ahead is the United States squaring off for tense relations with China, especially, and to some degree, Russia, and Europe trying to situate itself between the two. The comprehensive agreement on investment that the EU signed with China just weeks before the Biden administration came into office is a symbol of this. The German presidency was determined that this agreement should be signed, even though many felt that it would be appropriate not to give the United States a veto, but to coordinate with the incoming administration deemed to be so like-minded. And some in the entourage of President Biden clearly saw this as a slap in the face, something that Europe did not intend. We also had the irony just last week of the EU, which until now has been a proponent of human rights issues being uppermost in our relations with authoritarian regimes, seeing its high representative go off to Moscow and only touch very lightly on these issues, have very difficult meetings, and in fact have the Russian foreign minister run rings around him and coming back to Brussels a little bit with his tail between his legs. So in fact, it looks as though the United States in its relations with China and Russia will in fact be much more insistent, whether on issues related to the Uyghur or Tibet or Hong Kong or repression in China or in Russia, Navalny, who was scarcely mentioned in the course of the visit by the EU High Representative, than Europe. And I think finding a balance between the EU's desire to express its independence and to decide for itself on its orientation towards major international actors contrasts strongly with the feeling in the entourage of President Biden that they wish to reinforce transatlantic relations. And by this, they mean a common approach by Europe and the United States, as in past decades, on many of the global challenges. Just to close, this is crystallized, of course, by the concepts that very, very dear to the French President Macron of European sovereignty and of strategic autonomy. We could debate for hours, and we certainly won't do so this evening, what these topics mean. And in his long and interesting talk to the Atlantic Council last week, President Macron did give a positive spin to these concepts, indicating that they were not directed against the United States or against China, and would actually mean Europe assuming more responsibility for its own defense and not depending to such an extent on the United States, and therefore being a better and more active partner. But it's important to be aware that for the time being, these terms are pretty detested in Washington as implying a reluctance on the part of Europe to get on board on important issues where Washington believes there are common interests at stake, but where Europe is more keen on demonstrating its independence than it is on a common approach. Whether China, Russia, Iran, Turkey, the Middle East, the Balkans, in many of these areas, it will be important for Brussels, for European capitals and the United States to work together, but we can already see some ripples of tensions just below the surface.
Thank you, Michael. Very interesting. And I might want to come back to this question of China and Biden and so on, and the possible tensions between the US and Europe. But I don't think I mentioned earlier that we are open for questions. I guess the audience does know. There are a few have arrived, and maybe we could start answering them. Justin, can you see them? I guess I'm the only one who can see them. Shall we start with a question for you? And what do you, which is on the American electoral system? How should it, can and should it be modified so to make it more democratic? Do you see a possibility for this to happen?
Okay. The quick answer to the question is no. I don't see any possibility in the near future of the system being changed because of what I was underlining earlier, because of the this kind of lock that we have in the amendment procedure itself. It was drawn to my attention the last time we talked about the US by someone that is in this room, actually, about a proposal which is called the National Popular Vote, which is a law that has been approved, I think, by 13 states plus the District of Columbia, which, if it were to come into force in states representing the majority of the electoral votes, would then at that point become the rule, and that is that whoever wins the popular vote, the electoral votes would automatically go to that candidate. But I get the impression that in a way, even with this proposal, we're still in a lock that is very similar to that of amendment of the Fifth Amendment, because of Article 5, the amendment procedure, beg your pardon, because there are still a series of states that, in my opinion, are unlikely to approve this law and for us to ever reach that 270 mark. But that's one way of possibly modifying the electoral law, and without touching the electoral college. In other words, there would be no need for an amendment to the Constitution to do this, but automatically you would have the assigning of the majority of the electoral votes going to the candidate that has won the popular vote. Of course, I'm well aware of the fact, and then I'll stop here. I don't want to give a long-winded answer to the question. I'm well aware of the fact that that would, however, immediately tip the balance completely the other way, because we cannot deny the fact that the United States constitutional system is based on the fact that it is also a federal system. And by going in that direction, the states would lose power completely. So probably the ideal thing would be to maybe intervene, changing the electoral college in a way that there isn't this total malapportionment of the electoral votes that we have now. But as I say, I go back to what I underlined earlier. I just don't see that happening in any time in the near future, to be quite honest.
Thank you. There is another question for me, or for all of us really, and that has to do with where do you see American democracy going? Well, I guess that's what we're talking about. I think I'm going to think about that when I do have an answer. I can elaborate on my optimistic and pessimistic scenarios. But one thing I definitely wanted to do, and why don't we do this now, is give the floor briefly to Raffaella, because I know she was eager to talk about Kamala Harris and the role that the significance of her election and the role that she might play in the Biden administration. So why don't we give you the floor on that?
Yes. First of all, I would like to react to what Justin Frosini said about Kamala Harris. Of course, I didn't want to be too optimistic about what Kamala Harris could do in the Senate. And, you know, it's always difficult to understand what will be the position of a vice president. Is one of the most peculiar position in the American political system. However, I think we have to underline the importance of Kamala Harris' victory because it's a sort of response, a democratic response to many issues about the need to enlarge the American democracy. So in a way, Biden's choice was a way to give an answer, a positive answer to two parts of the democratic constituencies, which has proved to be crucial for the election for Biden's election. One is women. Traditionally, the gender gap is something that go to the Democratic Party, and if I'm not wrong, even the data that we find in the website of the Center for American women and politics prove this. No, the provisional data highlights the importance and the crucial role played by, especially by African American women in, for instance, the Georgia Project and the role played by Stacey Abrams proved to be very important in not only in the defeat of the two Republican candidates to the Senate in Georgia, but also in introducing a new way of mobilizing the electoral vote. So, in a way, the Kamala Harris election is a sort of positive response to the questions that African Americans and women pose to the American democracy. So the envision of the American democracy in terms of more diversity and more pluralism. And so in my view, I think that Kamala Harris could play the role of the so-called bridge leader. A bridge leader was a definition the historian Belinda Robnett used to many years ago to define the role played by African American women in the civil rights movement, a sort of link between the intellectual leadership and the ordinary men and women of African American communities. In this way, Kamala Harris could be the bridge leader, able to link the presidency with the Democratic constituencies in terms of representation and responsiveness, but also in envision, to give a positive way to see American democracy as able to represent the diversity of the American society and the plurality in terms of differences of race, ethnicity, and gender. So this is my optimistic view of Kamala Harris' role in the American presidency. By the way, I'm completely aware that political polarization didn't end with the Biden's victory, and this could be a very important issue in the next future.
Thank you. Okay, we have a lot of questions coming in now, and here I'll read one addressed to me. The Republican Party has demonstrated increasing sympathy towards conspiracy theories, resistance toward accepting the results of the election, and apologist rhetoric towards political violence. How should Americans and SAIS students effectively engage with those who still align themselves with the Republican Party? Well, I think one thing you can do is to point out to these people, to Republicans, that the Republican Party historically is something very different than what it has become recently. It's the party of Lincoln. It was the party of civil rights. The vast majority of Republican senators, whereas Democratic senators voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, an overwhelming number of Republicans supported it. You could point out to them that the most far-sighted, intelligent elements of the Republican Party today, as we sit here, you may not agree with them politically, but the ones who have the best interests of the party at heart, conservatives like former Senator Flake, Lynn Cheney, McConnell himself, are very concerned about they see the party facing an existential crisis, and they see the importance of somehow isolating the extremist wing. And I think, as I was saying, I mean, as a Democrat, I wasn't completely facetious when I said that Democrats should be hoping that Trump holds on to the party, that Trumpism remains the dominant string, because that's going to drag the party down. It's going to destroy the Republican Party, I think. But I think the Republican Party has, there's always been a historic conflict in the party between internationalists and isolationists, between conservatives and more progressives. And I think the Republican Party will probably come through it. I think, that this January 6th is going to have an educational effect, isn't it? It should have. What happened there is going to be shown to school children. It's going to be shown, the images. These people, there are now 230 or 40 people under arrest. These people are going to go to trial and they're going to go to jail. I mean, an example is going to be made of them. And I think the majority of Republicans will support that. So I think that this is an opportunity to isolate the extremist groups and who Trump has unfortunately encouraged and cultivated. And if I can continue for a minute, to get back to the question, the huge question, where is American democracy going? I think that what frightens me is a scenario where the Democratic Party is a majority party over the next decade, but it's the will of the majority is thwarted systematically by a Republican Party which increasingly represents white voters, but uses these instruments that we've talked about, the Electoral College, gerrymandering, voter suppression efforts, we didn't mention that, control of the courts at all levels to thwart the will of the majority. Then you have a real structural conflict in the US, which begins to resemble the 19th century, when the slave bloc thwarted the will of the majority, and eventually you had a crisis and a breakdown of the system. I'm not saying that will necessarily happen, but that could happen in the next decade. And you could also, the more optimistic view is that the Republican Party will renew itself. Maybe it will split and in order to survive, and we'll learn to cultivate. Maybe it's a good thing that there are more Hispanics and more African Americans voting for the Republican Party. That it will itself become more of a rainbow rather than simply a party that identifies itself with a threatened, besieged, decline white population. So there are some thoughts on that subject. Now let me get to another question here. Michael, I'm looking for one for you, but I see mainly for, here's one from Arna Hartman, and I'm going to give it to you, Michael. You presented us the European wish list for joint US-European cooperation with the new Biden administration. What would be our US priorities for the Europeans? What does the Biden administration want the Europeans to do?
Well, thanks, John. Thanks, Arno. I think that Biden will be looking to the Europeans to adopt common positions with Washington on the major issues of the day, on Russia and China, on the Middle East, wherever possible. And Biden will be disappointed if Europe equivocates. I think Biden will recognize that on many issues, Europe will have its own approach, and there will be situations in the EU's own neighborhood, in North Africa, in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, where the Europeans are in a better position to intervene and to act geopolitically, as they said they would wish to, than the United States. And if Biden can rely on the Europeans to be more proactive in these situations and to coordinate their own positions, then there will be less likelihood of the United States being dragged into regional conflicts in Europe's periphery. On trade issues, I think Biden will be looking to the Europeans to try and overcome some of these long-standing difficulties which have led to tariffs and retaliatory tariffs. As I mentioned, the Airbus Boeing is probably the longest running one of these sagas, but there are many others as well. And Biden will pick out those issues which will resonate most with his own electorate, being so close to the midterm elections, scarcely more than a year and a half away. I think that Biden will also, just like Trump, and in fact, just like Obama, be looking to Europe to do more to contribute to its own defense, whether moving closer to the 2% of GDP defense expenditure goal in the NATO framework or in the EU. Biden will have nothing against the EU concerting industrial policy on armaments, on the development of future weapon systems and other such areas, if it means that Europe will be able to do more to contribute to its own defense. It will object when this looks like weakening NATO or running counter to US interests.
Thank you, Michael. I just found another question for you, Michael, that has arrived, but I'm going to save that for the moment and give one to Justin. Actually, this is for Justin and me both. And Rafael, you can jump in if you want, but this is sort of interesting. Some have commented on the restraint of the Capitol Police during the storming of the Capitol. How do you think America would have reacted to far more Capitol Police officers using lethal force on the rioters?
Interesting question. It's not easy to answer that one, quite frankly. I think I have mixed feelings because I can't help thinking how Congress was protected when it came to the protests of Black Lives Matters, and how little Congress was protected when we knew that there was going to be this gathering outside Capitol Hill. At the same time, I think on the whole, the way things were managed was probably fortunate. Of course, there are out there some theories. I'm not sure whether they're to be considered conspiracy theories as to the fact of how these people that are now almost under arrest, under investigation, that were able to get into the office of Nancy Pelosi and so on and so forth. There's certain, I think there was this ITV journalist that was showing certain scenes where it looked as if the police were letting them in. On the whole, maybe considering the two sides of the element, maybe that was the best way to react to the whole thing, and that now they're being very thorough with the investigations and the arrests. And I would tend to agree with you, John, on this. If there's one thing that's still, I think, important, I mentioned this earlier, is this reaction that there seems to have been, this idea of having touched the institutions like this. One thing, this is where, okay, from a legal point of view, it's very interesting. This one thing is all the verbal, the tweets, and so on and so forth. Another thing is when you see Congress physically assaulted. It makes a difference, and the reaction from this point of view, I have to say, in this sense, is maybe in its small little way a model. Going back to the other question about American democracy, let's stop it with all this idea of the US exporting democracy and so on and so forth. But this reaction to an attack on the institutions is a lesson, and not only for high school kids in the US, which is extremely important, but also for the rest of the world. It is still a defining element. We've seen these things happen in other countries, and there hasn't been this sort of, if you like, civic constitutional reaction. It might sound like the devil's advocate of myself. That said, I still say that the Constitution is not to be considered sacred, but the reaction to this assault was on the whole positive, because there was a sense, my goodness, this cannot happen in the United States. And indeed, I'd go as far as to say it cannot happen in the United States, because it shouldn't.
Yeah, my reaction would be, I think I agree with what Justin said, and I think we should feel fortunate that there was not a bloodbath.
Yeah.
Imagine if the Capitol Police had been armed to the teeth and had opened fire, a Kent State for the right. Remember Kent State? Or right-wing martyrs. Imagine on social media. I think in a way it was a psychodrama. It was political theater, but it was relatively bloodless and contained. And it's going to have an effect. It's going to have an educational effect. It's going to be indelibly stamped on the minds of everybody. So I think in a way, if you the more I think about it, it was in some ways a fortunate event. So I think the fact that it was relatively peaceful and that it's going to be a lesson. I don't know if you, Raffaella, if you would like to comment on that question.
No, I agree with you both. I think we do not know enough to understand that there was a superficiality, inability to evaluate the danger. If there was also sort of a comprehension toward the people who pretend to be the new patriots. It's true that this is something that would have a sort of educational training in to be more exposed to the risk of the radicalization of political discourse. So we perceive that the so-called political civil war could be a real civil war. I think this is very important for a lot of people, even for Republicans who perhaps would not go so far in toward this kind of extremist acts or actions.
Thank you. Here's a question for me. I'm going to grab it immediately. Do you think Trump may have the chance to play the role that Ross Perot had in 1992? I guess you mean in the future, 2024. And I think that's an interesting question because in some ways, 1992 was a precursor of what happened in 2016. You had a national economic nationalist populist president who got almost 20% of the vote. And I think and Trump's career began, by the way, when he ran in the primaries to be the candidate for Perot's party in 1996. So you could have, if the Republican Party rejects Trump, you could have Trump forming a third party in 2024. And I think that's something that cynically Democrats should probably welcome, because he would split the Republican Party and guarantee the victory of Kamala Harris. Will she be? I think it's unlikely that Biden will be running for re-election in 2024. There's another question here about Biden. I'm worried that Biden is a buonista. For those of you who are not familiar with the expression, he's too much of it. He's a how would you translate that? He's too nice.
Too soft.
He's a softie. He's not going to be tough enough. And I would like to say something on that subject in a minute, but I think, Michael, you're overdue for a question. So I have two questions possibly for you, Michael. How is the EU different from the US in the Middle East? How will policy be different? And another one has to do with political polarization in Europe. Is it likely to follow the American pattern in terms of the demographic, related to the demographic makeup? Anyway, it's a rather long, complicated question, but do you see, I could arbitrarily rephrase the question. Do you say, what future for populism in Europe as a consequence of January 6th?
Okay, thanks very much, John. Well, I think on that latter question about populism, we could start briefly with a counterfactual, and let us imagine that Trump had been re-elected. I think there would have been an indirect political and psychological boost to what we loosely call populist, extreme nationalist movements within Europe, some of whom came out very openly in favor of Trump. We had the Prime Minister of Slovenia and others going around wearing a Trump cap In Italy, one of the political leaders, Salvini, clearly also went around strongly supporting Trump and so on. And had Trump won, I think that leaders of this stripe would have received a certain boost. And there are some similar factors on both sides of the Atlantic, the role that migration plays, for example, and threats to democracy that come from extreme movements on the left and on the right. So that particular risk has passed. But with that moment passed, I think the situation in each European country has its own logic and its own configuration. And I don't think one can say that, you know, the problems one sees in Central Europe, in Poland, in Hungary, or a populist challenge in Italy or in France or elsewhere is directly related to what comes next. I suppose we have the example of the defeat of a populist president, which is a certain warning perhaps to these movements in Europe. And the dream that was there some time ago that Steve Bannon, in the days when he was close to Trump, might organize populist movements throughout Europe, form training schools and camps for them and so on, with the US taking a lead in stimulating populism in Europe, that has gone for the time being. But obviously, just as Trumpism has not disappeared, then this brand of populism in Europe has not disappeared either. On the Middle East, it's clear that between the EU itself and the Trump administration, there was a wide gap, particularly on two areas. One, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the other on Iran. And broadly speaking, the European Union at least stuck to the goal of the two-state solution in the Middle East, however difficult that is becoming, whereas de facto, at least, the Trump administration supported policies being conducted, especially by Israel, that made that impossible, whereas Biden is going to revive US support for a two-state solution and see what can be done to encourage the Israelis and the Palestinians to re-engage. And the other big issue is Iran, where clearly the Trump administration abandoned the JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran, whereas the Europeans have been its main proponent. And Biden is going to look for a way back in. And if we had the time, which we don't, to scan from Libya to Syria, we would see that there have been serious divergences. That said, let's just remember that the EU is not a state, it's not a unitary actor, and although the institutions adopt certain lowest common denominator positions, we have quite divergent positions, and several member states, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, supported Trump quite strongly, and now they will have to get used to a new approach on these crucial issues in the EU's own backyard.
Thank you, Michael. A question from the floor.
Thank you very much. I was wondering, because a couple of times now, we have referred to the events that happened on January the 6th using this terminology, what happened on January the 6th. But what should we actually call that? It might be a bit of a technical or a linguistic question, but I feel like whether we call it a riot, a protest, a terrorist attack, an attempt at undermining the political discourse, these are different terms that hold value. So I was interested in hearing your opinion on that.
Should I quickly, and then you can add? It's a very good question, and it's an open question. We don't know. I mean, the FBI is actively trying to answer that question themselves, and they're trying to figure out to what extent there were conspiracies in advance, to what extent there was coordination within and among the various groups, the Proud Boys, the 3%ers, who are made up of mainly of police and military veterans, and the Oath Keepers, and so on. We'll see we'll find out, in the next 6 months, and when these people go to trial, I think we'll have a clear picture of the degree of premeditation and the degree of spontaneity. I suspect that it was the vast majority of people were just carried along with the flow, but there were some hardcore, well-organized people. And the scary part is that these people, I mean, if they've learned anything from this, it's that next time they better be better organized, and they better pick targets that are more easily accessible. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to see some degree of right-wing terrorism in the United States now, along the lines of Timothy McVeigh. I mean, God forbid, but you could see this. I mean, the real extremist wing of these people, the hardcore, they're certainly not going to give up. So anyway, it's a very good question.
Yeah, no, it is, John. I really don't really have much to add on that, because it's an open legal question. I mean, this is also going to be the issue with the impeachment trial itself, as to whether we could apply this same question to us as to whether Trump can be accused of incitement to violence. This is it's not simple from a legal perspective. So we'll see how this pans out.
Okay, I have Biden y Bonista is still in suspenso, so I'm going to say something on that. And I think I'm sure you won't mind mentioning that this question comes from our colleague, our nostro carissimo collega David Elwood, who's watching us from Torino. And I think, well, that's true. But my worry about him is not so much that he's too soft. I think my worry is about his health. I mean, whether he'll have the stamina, physical stamina to stick with this. But I think I wouldn't underestimate Biden. I think he has been underestimated in the past, including quite recently. And he's a pragmatic figure. He's a deal maker. He's very experienced. He's a very savvy politician. And I think that you will see him get things done. You already have. I mean, and there are some lessons have been learned from Obama. One is, the first one is, of course, this 1.9 trillion. I mean, who would ever have dreamed of a figure like that? Bill, which they're probably going to get through Congress. And the stimulus program, which dwarfs the size of the one that Obama passed initially. That's on top of the one that was passed in December. So I think that it's a real bazooka, to use Draghi's expression. So I wouldn't underestimate Biden. And here's a question maybe for you, Raffaella. And it has to do with the fallout of the January 6th events. How will it, and also from Michael, how will it affect, since you're Europeans, how will it affect the ability of the United States to advocate democratic reform around the world? To what extent has the US standing been diminished around the world as a result of January 6th?
This is a good question, because of course the problem is how to completely avoid the so-called exceptionalist model that sometimes has been one of the driving forces of the American hegemony in the world. Of course, I think that what happened in January really undermined this kind of tradition in political discourse, which see the American democracy as the city on the hill. But I would also say that the Amanda Gorman's speech in the inauguration, so the hill that we climb, she said during the inauguration, could be an interesting point of view to understand what would be the difference between the American democracy as a work in progress compared with other democracy, even Western democracy. If I think to Italy, for instance, Italy is a sort of stagnant democracy compared to the American one, which is very conflicting. Conflicts are really tough in the United States right now. The party polarization is very high. On the other hand, it's also a dynamic democracy. It's a democracy in which you have a Black South Asian vice president. You have a lot of other women appointed by Biden in the cabinet, in the crucial positions in the administration. And so from this point of view, I think that, of course, January the 6th was a break in this exceptionalist tradition and discourse, but in a way, it's another way to see how democracy is able to combine these different and conflicting forces and to move on.
Michael, would you like to comment on that?
I agree with Raffaella, and I think that in different ways, democracy being under threat to some degree in both the United States and in Europe, it creates a potential common agenda in strengthening democracy, both at home and in other states. And it also brings a degree of modesty, if not humility, which might be expecting a little bit too much, in their approach. Biden, in the lead up to the election, has advocated an alliance of democracies. And the way this was presented before the election was somewhat gung-ho, as we might have said in the old days in Britain, with America leading the world when it comes to an alliance of democracies. We might wish that, but the fact that America too has had these challenges, just as Europe has. And at the same time, we've had a major setback, for example, in the budget deal in the European Union, where we more or less de facto gave up on rule of law conditionality for spending under the new budget in countries like Hungary and Poland. Technically, we didn't give up and the provisions are still there, but in fact, it's been pushed to the future. So we both have these challenges, and it's an agenda both at home and abroad. So I think both sides can cooperate, but not in the sense of democracy promotion of the type that was pursued at the beginning of the 21st century between the Bush administration and the Europeans, but rather a more modest approach to state building, to working together to reinforce the foundations of democracy, recognizing that it's a problem at home as well as abroad.
You know, I think if you read the speech that Biden gave to the State Department, where he sets out a kind of foreign policy vision last Thursday, he recognizes this. He recognizes that that the United States has to address its domestic problems if it wants to retain its credibility. I'm reminded something that George Kennan said, that he wrote in his famous long telegram in 1946, the purpose of which was to call attention to the Soviet threat. But if you read it carefully, he also said something else, that every successful attempt to solve our domestic problems is a diplomatic victory worth 1,000 diplomatic notes. And I think that Biden would agree with that. So I think we're more or less at the end of our time, but there is maybe time for one more question, Sarah. And I apologize now to all the people whose questions I didn't answer. In some cases, I tried to combine them 2 or 3 questions into one. But inevitably, we are going to leave a few questions hanging.
Thank you. I was wondering what kind of foreign policy towards the Middle East can we expect? Will it be more or less interventionist, more collaborative? What can we expect?
Shall we have another seminar on that? Or shall we? Well, I think Michael actually began to answer that. I mean, he mentioned that the Biden administration certainly plans to return, if possible, to the JCPOA. In some ways, I don't think that it's going to be all that different from Trump's. I don't invite, and no, there were positive aspects to the Trump foreign policy. I think that Biden is certainly not going to be looking for places to intervene militarily in the Middle East. I don't think that there will be. I think the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the withdrawal of troops from Iraq and Syria will continue. and they will try to build on that'll be tricky in a way, because they're going to try to stake out a more intermediate position between the strong pro-Israel, pro-UAE, Saudi Arabia stance of the Trump administration, anti-Iran, and try to find some sort of equilibrium, a new dialogue with Iran and so on. How it will work out, I don't know. Remember, another quote that comes to mind is Harold Macmillan, when they asked him, remember the Prime Minister of Great Britain, I'm sure Michael uses this all the time, and they asked Macmillan what had been the greatest influence on his policy. And his answer was, events, dear boy, events. I mean, things that will happen that you can't foresee are going to play a major role. So they're going to be crises. But
another version of that, John, was "stuff happens," spoken by an American sage. But if I could just one sentence on the Middle East, really one sentence, I think that Biden will not try to undo, for example, the normalization between Israel and a number of Gulf states that was brought about by the Trump administration. But Trump did that pretty much ignoring the Palestinian issue. Whereas I think Biden is more likely to try and mobilize some of these Arab states, which have now normalized relations with Israel, to get back to seeking a solution to the Palestinian problem.
Okay, well, on that note, I think we're going to have to call an end to the session. Thank you all very much for coming and participating remotely. And let's do it again sometime.
Thank you.
Raffaella, Michael.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.